One of the more underappreciated aspects of historical work is how often things can actually change. You'd think it isn't common because history is written in stone and all of that. However, sometimes a new discovery can upend everything you know about something. It's more common for some minor change, yes, but every once in a while, well, today's video is one of those upend everything cases. In doing the research for Kitakami, I came upon an interesting discovery. A couple pictures of her sister ship, Oi, taken from a Japanese propaganda film. This would have been interesting enough on its own. There's very few pictures of either of those ships. What makes this particularly fascinating is what they show. Oi and her torpedo cruiser refit, or at least mostly. Prior to this, we only had one picture, a very blurry reconnaissance photo of Kitakami in that layout, and none of her sister. It was, as the traditional story goes, a short-lived period in their lives. Though in fairness, we also lack any imagery of the fast transport stage that followed it. However, this footage of Aoi upends this, because the footage in question originates from 1944. Needless to say, the conventional wisdom is this. She wasn't in that refit and hadn't been for about 2 years as of the time this recording was made. You can see why this changes the entire story of this ship. Sure, it's not on the same level as, say, Ballard confirming Titanic broke when she sank, simply because Aoi is a largely forgotten ship. Nonetheless, from a historical studies perspective, it's fascinating. Hence, well, this video. We'll be going over just why this is so interesting for Aoi in particular, but also how this simple little video changes some other stories as well. First, though, it's necessary to set the stage. I won't be covering the entire story of Aoi today, with this coming in a dedicated overview, but I will cover what she was supposed to be according to the conventional wisdom, with this story beginning in 1941 when this ship, alongside Kitakami, went in for the mimetic refit, the wall of skill as it were. This rebuild came in August 1941 and finished by the end of September. In it, both Kitakami and Aoi were heavily modified. The two Kuma-class cruisers lost 3 of their 7 14-centimeter, 5.5-inch guns. The 3 mounted aft of the funnels. They retained the 4 mounted on the bow, but those became the secondary focus, because the cruisers had extensions made to their beam running down much of the ship, from aft of the bridge back to a new built-up stern superstructure. This allowed for the fitting of no fewer than 40 torpedo tubes, split into 10 quadruple mounts, 5 to a side. It's this refit that has become the defining feature of the two ships. It was part of the Japanese doctrine of the time, envisioning mass night torpedo attacks prior to the main battle fleets engaging one another, and it's hard to be more massive than a 40 torpedo volley in addition to the destroyers that Kitakami and Aoi were meant to lead. Or, if you prefer, if the two ships were together, an 80 torpedo volley. This was the theory anyway. I don't think it's much of a spoiler to say that kind of decisive battle would never take place. In the aftermath of the battering at Midway, the Japanese shifted to a mostly defensive stance, a consequence of which would be the second major refit for Kitakami and Aoi. As it goes, the two cruisers were refit again a year after the initial rebuild. In August and September 1942, they had 4 of the torpedo mounts removed, reducing them to a still impressive 24 torpedoes and 6 quad mounts. The reason for this work was simple in the end: to replace the missing tubes with 2 Daihatsu barges. With this, the cruisers became fast transports, and would arguably prove more useful in this role in any case. From September 1942 through early 1944, they would sail up and down the Pacific, carrying men and supplies wherever the Japanese needed them. It was important and useful work, to say the least, even if not the most glamorous. It's easy to see why this is largely ignored in pop history in favor of the previous layout, even ignoring the various video games. However, it's here where that new video comes into the equation. While Kitakami was in dock for repair, her sister Oi was continuing transport runs. This is something that Combined Fleet notes, as does Japanese Cruisers of the Pacific War, which does note a series of refits to Oi, but without any indication of a change to the ship. Just the usual overhaul. Interestingly, though, the oldest source, Warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy, notes Oi having a unique refit in 1943. 4 127mm 5-inch dual-purpose guns, and all 40 of the torpedo tubes. That's an interesting quirk, I think, considering every other source that I can find holds to the more traditional story. Either way, other sources, such as Combined Fleet, have Aoi operating in the transport role into 1944, with a detour for a canceled Indian Ocean operation at the start of March 1944. When that plan was abandoned, Oi was sent off to Batavia and Java, where she arrived on March 15th. When it comes to the traditional story, she remained in that area until March 25th, before a series of transport runs that ultimately culminated in the ship being torpedoed on July 19th, 1944, in the South China Sea, where she broke in 2 under tow, sinking with 153 of the crew. And that's the usual version of the story of Aoi, with the exception of that detour from Warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy. One that becomes very fascinating, actually, in light of that footage, which we'll move to now. This footage evidently surfaced online in 2021. If you've watched it and wondered why there's non-Japanese dialogue in it, well, that relates to how it was discovered. In Indonesia, where this had apparently been filmed back in 1944 as a propaganda piece. So there's dialogue in Indonesian because this was the target audience. When you look at the Wayback Machine archive of the full video, 11 minutes long, it becomes even more apparent that this was always a propaganda film. Before you ask, or if you haven't checked the link in the description, the 2 or so minutes on YouTube is all of the ship footage. The rest is more typical propaganda fare. In any case, that footage features a group of G4M Betty bombers on a training mission. This involved flying low and slow against some Japanese warships that were stationed in the area to train for torpedo attacks against any potential Allied landings. I would assume so anyway, or something of that nature. That isn't exactly a surprise. It's actually a pretty normal sort of training exercise, no matter the country back then. The ships could work on their evasion, and the bombers could train in attack runs. It would allow for both the Navy and the pilots to prepare for future attacks, or defending against those attacks, as the case may be. What makes this one interesting is how it was filmed, and that film, in turn, adapted to a propaganda feature. I can't say with absolute certainty, I don't think anyone can, but there's a likely reason for this. Your average Indonesian is not exactly going to know the difference in naval ships between countries. So use your otherwise normal training, film it, and then cut that into a propaganda film, showing brave Japanese aviators defending Indonesia from Western aggression or the like. That would be my assumption anyway, though I'll freely admit I could be wrong. If anyone who's watched that video speaks Japanese, Indonesian, or both, by all means let me know how on or off the mark I am. Regardless, this footage features 4 things that I can identify. The Bettys are one, which we'll be touching on again in a second, along with 3 Japanese cruisers that were filmed close enough to identify. One of them, obviously, was Aoi, the topic of this video. Another was the heavy cruiser Aoba, the final of the 4 original Japanese heavy cruisers by this point of the war, instantly recognizable from her 3 twin turrets to the aviation facilities on the stern. No other surviving Japanese cruiser looked like this, which leaves the third one. This one is also very distinctive in design, being one of the 3 stack 5,500-ton cruisers, a cousin to Aoi. That ship was a Kuma. This one was a member of the successor design, the Nagara. Almost certainly Kinu in this case. Both combined fleet and cruisers of the Pacific War, cite Kinu being with Aoi at the time, and just as importantly, with Aoba. So we know that these ships were present in the general Dutch East Indies area on March 19th, 1944. That lends credence to the film being legitimate, as does the apparent discovery in 2021, well before AI fakeouts started to become a thing. Why someone would make this elaborate a fakeout for a 2-minute on YouTube and 11-minute on the Wayback Machine historical video, I don't know. But it's still important to note these days. That aside, let's return to the other focus of this video, the Betty bombers. While I'm generally never going to even remotely trust Twitter comment chains, there was some interesting digging on the Japanese side, identifying those Bettys as late 1943 production models, which would fit with the 1944 date. Moreover, based on the tail markings, the bombers were identified as part of the 732nd Air Group, which apparently had archived logs that actually survived the war. That's a rarity in of itself, with how many Japanese records were burnt or otherwise lost. For the moment, the important part is this. Those records indicate training duty on March 19th, 1944. Training duty that matches up with light cruiser service records of Aoi and Kinu, or at the least, the 16th Squadron that they were a part of. So 3 out of the 4 are matched up as a result. Aoba is the odd one out because records of her service aren't as easy to locate. Nonetheless, combined fleet and cruisers of the Pacific War have her in this general area at this general time. So this would match as well. I shouldn't need to say, take all of this with a massive heaping of salt. But I will anyway. I don't think the Japanese comment chains are lying by any stretch. But, well, Twitter. I'll also link a Japanese hobby site that consolidates the information. Needless to say, never underestimate model makers and their need to have accurate information, though you'll have to translate the website, being as it's in Japanese. Either way, even just referencing combined fleet and print sources matches up pretty well in of itself. So there's that. The only question then is, why exactly does Aoi have all her torpedoes? And that's something I don't think we can answer until something turns up in a Japanese archive or such. Not definitively. Though it is worth turning to that hobby site and how it compares to other sources. It references a battle report from Aoi, which cites tubes 5, 6, 7, and 8 as damaged when the ship sank. Conventional wisdom would have those 4 being the aft mounts. However, Aoi was only ever noted as losing 4 of her 10 mounts, which means, of course, there should actually be 6 mounts aboard the ship. Prior to this video showing up, you could argue that maybe 2 more mounts were removed, or alternatively, that the torpedoes that sank the ship didn't damage the forward 2 mounts. However, the article notes that it was practice to change the numbering of the mounts in the event the layout changed. Looking at the footage, it seems the former 3 and 4 mounts, the ones by the funnel, are gone, leaving exactly 8 of the mounts total. If they were renumbered, that would mean you have mounts 1 and 2 at the forward end, then 3 and 4 by the aft funnel, and back from there would be 5 through 8, the ones damaged in the sinking. It's an interesting speculation, I think, and it's clear one way or another that Aoi had more than 6 mounts fitted at the time. So at some point, the cruiser was refit again. Why? Who knows? In the end, what matters at the moment is that this throws the historical record about this ship out the window. Aoi may not be a famous ship, but I think this makes an interesting discovery myself. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.